A lot. I had my first class wearing a mask on Friday, and it wasn't awesome. Like it was okay, but it's going to be a long year. We took Annalise to college yesterday, and I was really sad about it. Like she's our oldest, and we were sending her off for the first time, and I was really sad, and she was kind of sad. And just as we were saying goodbye, she was talking about how much she's going to miss everybody, and I said, well, you could have just gone to UT and stayed at home. And she straightened up and said, nah, this is better. So we figured that's probably a good way to end things with that. Okay, so as you know, we've been going through the lectionary, and every Sunday there's a series of texts that are just kind of prescribed, and each one of us takes whatever text shows up on that particular day. But I happened to look ahead today because I wasn't sure if I was preaching today or next week. So I looked at both, and it turns out that on each day, today and next Sunday, the texts are back to back. So the epistle for next week for this week is Romans 12, 1 through 8. Next week it's 9, 12, 9 through the end of the chapter. So I just asked if I could kind of treat this as a two-parter, since they kind of go together, and my inclination is to use the whole chapter anyway. And so that's what we're going to do. So I'm kind of setting some stuff up this week, and then so you have to come back next week, and we'll and the payoff will hopefully happen then. And there's a lot of good text too, right? I love this chapter of Romans. It's the story of Moses in the Old Testament reading, and it's Peter's confession of Jesus in the New Testament reading. And I just knew there's no way I could get all that into a single sermon, so we're gonna divide this one up into two, with your permission and patience. So let's just jump in. This is gonna make me sound like a nerd, but I guess I am. I'm kind of a Civil War history buff. Which my family hates because we plan vacations around Civil War sites. So they've been to a lot. And Adelaide hit the Civil War unit in her American history class, and she knew everything and was it paid off in one way, but otherwise they don't really love going to battlefields. But it's fun for me. Anyway. One of the things I've learned by reading Civil War history is the difference between a strategy and a tactic, right? That comes up a lot, but it's actually a pretty important part of military doctrine, right? You have to distinguish strategies from tactics. So the strategy refers to the overall goal, and the tactic is the means by which you get there, right? Does that make sense? So for instance, in the Civil War, and they will often say, military people often say, the more specific your strategy is, the better, right? So sometimes a strategy will be win the war or defeat the Confederacy or something like that. Well, that's not very helpful. But if you can say defeat the Confederacy by cutting off supplies so that they can't feed themselves, right? That's a strategy, right? So that's going to be the goal. And in fact, that was kind of the strategy by the North against the South in the Civil War. They wanted to cut off the South's ability to feed itself. And so they call it the Anaconda Plan. And so they kind of squeezed off both sides of it, then the Mississippi and then the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. And that way they couldn't get goods in and out. And so they lacked resources. So that's the strategy, it's the overall goal. And then the question becomes, how do you do that, right? And those are the tactics. What are the specific means by which you go about executing that plan? And so, for example, in the Civil War, they realized that they had to control the Mississippi River. And so they actually had to build a whole fleet of boats that could, Navy ships that could be effective on a river, right? Deep sea boats didn't work that great on the Mississippi. And figure out how to use those effectively. If you ever read the story of the Battle of Vicksburg, which is a fortified town on the Mississippi, that was a tactical battle. They had a lot of trouble figuring out. They had to, neutralize that town so that they could move up and down the river. But that was really a very difficult tactical battle because it was so heavily fortified and impossible to get to. So that's kind of the difference I want us to pursue. There's strategy, the overall goal. Tactic is the means by which you get to that goal. I think Christian mission works that way. We'll sometimes read Paul and say Paul has a kind of theoretical section and a practical section. Like this happens in Romans, Ephesians is a classic example of that. The first half of the book is kind of theory, and second half of the book is practice. Like, what do you do? But another way to think about that is that there's a kind of strategy part of it, and then the tactics part of it, right? So what he'll do is lay out the grand plan. This is what we're about, and then he'll start to talk about specific ways of reaching that plan. And those would be the tactics, right? So we're going to think in terms of strategy and tactics, and I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about Romans. So in the first 11 chapters of the book or so, he kind of lays out the plan, right? What is the gospel about? And then he'll give us some specific tactics. Starting verse 12, what we read today, he'll give us some specific tactics for how you get there. So let's step back then a little bit and kind of think in terms of what was his strategy, right? What was the problem he had to solve, and then what is the kind of overall plan for solving that problem? And then that'll help us understand, I think, what's going on in chapter 12, because it'll set up, right, why these tactics in response to that specific strategy. Okay, so far so good. The problem he faces in Romans is that he has a church that's not getting along. And that church is mostly ethnically or religiously divided, right? It's former Jewish people and former Gentile people who are coming to church together. And they don't particularly like each other, and they're not really getting along. And so they're spending a lot of time kind of arguing about why the former Jewish people are better Christians or the former Gentile people are better Christians. And in the first couple of chapters of Romans, he sort of lays out the arguments, right? The Gentile people say, well, we're more religious. And the former Jewish people say we're more religious. And the Gentile people say, no, you're hypocrites. And so they're just not, right? They're just fighting mostly. And so his strategy, right, his response to that is to say the gospel is universal, right? He's crystal clear about that in all of his writings. You can't make a distinction between a Gentile and a Jew, or he'll go on to say, or a man and a woman, or someone who's rich or someone who's poor, right? Doesn't matter. Christ comes for everyone. The gospel belongs to everyone. That's the basis of our missionary movement, right? We don't think you have to be a specific kind of nationality or a specific kind of person. We take the gospel to the whole world, right? It's in a lot of ways the foundation of the gospel itself. And so his strategy in Romans is to create a church where these two groups can get along. What he wants at the end of the book, I think, is for the Jews and the Gentiles to be able to get along with each other. And so that's kind of the big strategy. And so then the question is, how do we do that? What specific steps can we take to help a church that's not getting along to get along, especially a church that's kind of ethnically and religiously divided like that? How do we help them get along? What do we do to help them sort of to come to church and be in harmony with each other? I really appreciated the prayer, in fact, because we're in a divisive moment too, and I think a lot of the tactics might even play well in our moment as well. All right, so 3 tactics then that show up in Romans. The first tactic is a kind of intellectual one. He wants to convince everyone that this is okay, and he spends a lot of time in Romans laying out a theory of the gospel that makes it okay for Jews and Gentiles to get along. I think he's assuming that one of the barriers to their get along is that they just don't believe that the gospel applies to the other person. And so he has to explain really clearly that Jesus came for everyone. And I don't know if you, when I was in church camp, we memorized Romans 3:23, for all have sinned, fall short of the glory of God, and just stopped there. But that distorts that passage, right? If you start at Romans 3:21 and go to the end of the chapter, what he's really talking about is all have sinned, meaning Jews and Gentiles, right? Everyone is equally sinful, which means that everyone is equally saved in the same way by faith. And who can have faith? Do you have to be a Gentile, a Jew to have faith, a former Jew to have faith? No, Gentiles can have faith in the same way. In fact, there's no distinction, right? That's language he uses. The faith of my Jewish friend is no different, former Jewish friend is no different than the faith of my former Gentile friend. And so what he wants is to kind of create this thought world in which you look at everybody and recognize that they're fully Christian in the same way that you are. So if I come to church and think, wow, look at that, like I guess I'd be in the Gentile group. So I come to church and I look at my former Jewish friend and say, wow, they're not as good a Christian as I am. Paul is saying you can't do that, right? You can't make that judgment because their faith is the same as your faith, right? There's no difference on the level of faith. So that's tactic one. Tactic two then follows from that. And what he wants to say there is on the basis of this, you got to change your mind. You got to change the way in which you think about the world. There's a philosopher named Iris Murdoch who tells a parable about a mother and her daughter-in-law, right? So the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law. And the mother-in-law doesn't like the woman that her son is married. She thinks she's frivolous. She thinks she's not suitable for her kid, and just it just really doesn't like her very much. But being the kind of person that doesn't like to make a scene, she never acts like it. So every time the daughter-in-law comes over to her house, she's very nice to her. She treats her very well, buys her gifts, is solicitous to her, makes her feel welcome in her home. So she worked really hard never to show that she doesn't like the daughter-in-law. But as you and I know, right, and this is kind of Murdoch's point, you can't really hide it. Like you always know that right, even when you're kind of acting that way, there's always a little bit of, you just kind of know, right, that it's not entirely genuine. And so then the question is, what's the mother-in-law supposed to do? Because she's acting properly, but deep down, she knows that it's just not authentic. It's just not true. Well, what Murdoch says is, what you have to do is just to change your mindset. And the way you do that is to keep telling yourself that the daughter is actually a good person. And so every time you come into contact with the daughter, you start to think nice things about her, right? So when the daughter walks in the room, instead of allowing herself to think, wow, she's really dippy, you think, wow, she's really dressed nice today. And when she walks in the room, you think, boy, I wish my son had married somebody else, right? And then when she walks in the room, you think, wow, she really is raising our kids well. And right, what you do is just change your mindset. And you do that by changing the way you think, right? You change your language about the person that you come into contact with. And it's a mental discipline. It's a really, really difficult mental discipline. But Paul calls us to that kind of mental discipline all the time here, because what he wants us to do is to change the way we think, right? So when you encounter somebody in your church or your family or whatever whom you don't like, that's not inherently bad, except that, especially if you don't act like it, but except that it really is kind of bad. And so the way you change it is to start to think positive thoughts. You change the way you think about that person. And it really is just the mental discipline. When he says, do not be conformed to the world, I think that's part of what he's getting at, right? When you see somebody you don't like, how do you think differently? How do you change the way you think? Well, you find language that allows you to see them in a positive light. And the moral of the parable is that over time, right, it doesn't happen instantaneously, but over time, Murdoch says, you actually start to do that instinctively, right? And so instead of thinking, boy, I wish you'd marry somebody else, you think, wow, they're doing great, right? Great kids. He really loves each other. And you just replace the language, you replace the way of thinking about the person. I think that's pretty profound. I think that's a really important tactic, a specific way that we can kind of get at the problem of changing our mindset, of not being conformed to the world, but transforming, renewing our minds to think about the world in a different way. And it's a really specific kind of tactic. Okay, so that's tactic 2. So tactic 1 is convince everyone that this is true, right? So we need a kind of a theological framework. Tactic 2 is begin to transform your mind, renew your mind so you think about people in different ways. And it's kind of a language game. You say different words about them. You find positive things to say. Which leads to tactic 3, which is kind of the focus of this passage. I think this is, and the tactic is to practice your spiritual gifts. It's almost unexpected to me if you lay it out this way, except that when you pay attention to the way in which he describes the gifts, it starts to make sense. Paul talks about spiritual gifts 3 times, here in Corinthians and in Ephesians. He does it slightly differently every time, but the theme is always the same. The theme is use these to get along. Right? The goal of the spiritual gift is to help you get along. And in this case, he really hits that point hard. What he wants to say is, you practice your gift in a way that forces you to acknowledge the importance of the other person. In other words, your gift is a challenge because on the one hand, your gift is a point of pride, right? If I'm a good teacher or something, I'm proud of the way that I can teach. It's a kind of point of pride. But at the same time, the purpose of the gift is not for me at all, right? It's not to make me happy. It's not to make me famous or anything like that. The gift is to serve the church, right? And so I have to learn to exercise the gift in the way that acknowledges that everyone else is important. So a couple of ways of explaining this. One is he uses the analogy of a body. And my dad used to say, in a sermon on Corinthians, but it applies here, right? He had a sermon called "Who Wants to Be the Liver?" And the answer is nobody, right? If you're going to pick your favorite organ in the body, who wants to be the liver? Nobody wants to be the liver. He never once had somebody say, "Yeah, it sounds like fun. I'd like to be the liver." But if you've ever, when I was in Minnesota, we lived just down the street, literally from the Mayo Clinic. And very often people so the clinic attracts, it's the best hospital in the world, and it attracts people from literally all over the world. One time I was walking downtown and I saw a line of limousines that went about a block and a half. And then behind that was a line of U-Haul trucks that went around the rest of the block. So it was literally a full city block with limos and U-Haul trucks. And turns out it was one of the crown princes from Saudi Arabia had been in town to get treatment at the clinic and brought his whole entourage, like all of his family members and all their luggage, right? So all those trucks were full of luggage. So the clinic just brought people from all over. And sometimes churches would call the college where I worked and ask if somebody could go up and visit people from their church who were there in town for the clinic. So I did that several times. And one time I visited a person who was waiting for a liver transplant. Have you ever seen somebody's liver's failing? So they're so jaundiced because the liver can't clear out the waste in the body. And I walked in and the guy was laying in the bed. He's very nice and very friendly, but he was just bright yellow, like from hair. Literally his hair was yellow, his eyeballs were yellow, his skin was yellow. He reached out his hand, for me to shake it. And I thought, I don't know if I want to touch is it okay to even touch you like when your skin's like that? And it was, but it was, right. It's your liver is absolutely essential. And whatever pride you feel about being the liver or the heart or the lungs or whatever, right? All the parts are necessary for the body to function effectively. And that's how you have to think. Whatever gift you have, it's essential for the body, but it's essential for the body, right? It's not essential for yourself. It's essential for the body. And it only makes sense within the context of the whole. When I was in grad school in Milwaukee, I was asked to be part of a new church plant in the city. It's now called River Glen Christian Church. It's a really great experience. One of the best church experiences of my life. But the thing they asked me to do, I was a little offended by this because I had a seminary degree and lots of preaching and teaching experience, and I was working on a theology degree, and so So I was part of this new church plant, and they asked me when it came time to sort of deciding who was going to do what on Sunday mornings. They asked me if I wouldn't mind. We met at a school. If I wouldn't mind being the person that pushed the sound equipment up from the basement where we stored everything to the auditorium where we preached. So that was my role. Like I'll be honest, I was a little offended, right? Because I felt like I should have a different role given who I was. But nope, they would just want me to push carts. So, so I did it, right? So every Sunday I'd get up and go and push carts and set up the sound stuff. And sometimes I'd run the board, that was kind of fun. But mostly I was just there for grunt labor. The best moment was, though, they had a professional come in to do a concert, and they wanted to use our sound equipment. So they hired a professional sound engineer, and he couldn't figure out how to set up our equipment. So they called me in to show him how to do it. So I felt good about that. And I remember one of my kind of mentors is a guy named Chuck Sackett, who taught preaching at Lincoln and is a full-time preacher now. And he came to do a retreat, and I was talking to him about this, and he was asking me what I was doing in the church, and I said, well, I'm not really doing much. I'm just kind of pushing carts, and it's great, but just kind of pushing carts. And he said to me exactly what I think Paul is saying to this church here, which is that's what you should be doing, right? That's the job in front of you. And your task as a Christian is to fulfill that, to exercise that gift. This is what the church needs. They don't need you to do communion every Sunday. They need you to push carts. So push some carts and be all right with that. And he was absolutely right. It was a really good lesson for me. He was exactly right. That you just do the job that's in front of you because that's what the group needs. And when you do that, then your mindset changes and you are way more open to the message of the universality of the gospel. You want to spark interest in missions, start to push some carts, right? Because then missions takes on a completely different kind of arena within which we can operate. Okay, so that's part one. There's more to say about this, and we'll pursue some of that next week. But maybe since we got a few minutes, let's think about what is your gift? I'd actually really be interested in hearing, like what is your gift, and think about it both in terms of what you think you're good at, right? And that's a legitimate way to think about gifts. Right? I think I'm good at teaching, and I believe that's part of what I'm called to. But also think about kind of what's in front of us, right? We need you to think about your own kind of inventory, but also what do we need you to do? If you're thinking about your role in the body. So just anybody jump in, like just tell us what you think, and there's no pressure here. You don't have to get it right, but it just kind of spark some thinking, and then we'll pursue this more next time. And we can even think, right, if you don't want to kind of be that personal about it, just think about what we need, right? That's even a legitimate way to think about it. What gifts do we need in the moment? And then maybe we can start to think about how we slot into those sort of needs. Because I'm convinced that the Spirit assigns gifts according to need, right? That the church fulfills needs according to the gifts of the Spirit.
Well, I'd say right now, my gift is to do whatever it takes that needs to be done.
Yeah. I can get behind that.
Those of us who know you would say that that's exactly what you do.
I feel like, Gary, like you said, Mark, the gifts change over time. And right now, with everything that's going on, I have felt that often that my gift right now is encouragement. And so I try to sing cards to people that I think need them and that kind of thing. But I don't think that's my only gift, but I think that's the one I'm using right now.
Sure. Yeah, I love that, because you're responding to the need that's in front of us. And that's an extraordinary need right now. That's great.
Yeah, Mark, as you were saying that, I was actually thinking of other people's gifts, looking at people on the screen. And Alice, I actually thought of encouragement with you, and I thought about Phil's prayer and the wisdom
Mhm.
and pastoral concern in that prayer, and thought about Robin and Tyson and the behind the scenes work that they do, pushing carts
Mhm.
to keep things going, even setting up every week the online meetings and all the other things that they do. And I think a part of this is not only what we think our gifts might be, but what the church thinks our gifts might be.
Yeah.
I have a lot of students that come to Johnson saying, I'm called to preach. And my question is, well, does anybody else think you're called to preach?
Mhm. Yeah, that's super important. And often the answer is no, but sometimes it's yes. But seriously, one of the reasons I'm comfortable saying that my gift is teaching is that I was commissioned by my church to teach my Grandview up in Johnson City before I left to go to my PhD program. It was almost an ordination, except it was really just the way the elders affirming that this is what I was supposed to be doing. That was extraordinarily meaningful for me.
This made me think of, there was a documentary on PBS a couple years ago, and it was about janitors who work at like very prestigious universities. And one of them that they chronicled was the janitor that cleans Duke Chapel at Duke University. And they interviewed him, and he had a very sacramental view of what he was doing. He said that he was cleaning the floor and dusting for the glory of God. And he came to work every day with this vocational sense of calling, that he was there to clean this beautiful house of worship so that others could experience God's love. It was very meaningful.
Yeah,
And that kind of made me think about that.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to see that. Good. Anybody else? I mean, we don't have to. The other question, which we can maybe hold off until next time, is what is the role of faith here? One of the interesting parts of Romans 12 is that he uses faith a lot. The gift is given according to faith, which is different. He doesn't talk that way in Corinthians or Ephesians. So maybe we can think about that more a little bit next time. But there is some correlation between faith and the exercise of your gift here as well.